Welcome to Disparities Times, a podcast dedicated to the easy task of tackling the 21st century. It is a project born out of my conviction that doing so requires an interdisciplinary and intersectional approach to understanding our complex world. I'm your host, Jefim, and in these episodes I bring you conversations at the intersection of politics, history, philosophy, culture, science, and all the fun stuff in between. The following episode was first published for monthly Patreon supporters. To become a monthly Patreon supporter, please head out to patreon.com/FireTheseTimes or check the website for other methods. You can become a supporter for as little as $1 a month. And if you cannot donate, you can still support this project by sharing with your friends and family and leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. The music of this podcast is by Tarabit. Here's the episode. So this is a conversation with Jefim Vogel and Julia Steinberger about a paper that they co-wrote entitled Socioeconomic Conditions for Satisfying Human Needs at Low Energy Use, an International Analysis of Social Provisioning. I'm also going to read to you the very first paragraph of the abstract because I think it summarizes the paper pretty well. Meeting human needs at sustainable levels of energy use is fundamental for avoiding catastrophic climate change and securing the well-being of all people. In the current political economic regime, no country does so. Here we assess which socioeconomic conditions might enable societies to satisfy human needs at low energy use, reconcile human well-being with climate mitigation. I should say that the paper is available for free online. I will link it in the description of this episode as well as on the blog post as usual. So this is an episode that is largely based on hard science, and for that reason, I tried my best to not just be an engaging host, as I hope I was, but also try and bring in those two experts to talk to a wider public. As usual, I depend on your feedback to know whether I've done a decent enough job and whether you have some feedback as to how to improve and do better next time. So that's it from me, folks. Thank you for listening and take care.
So my name is Jefim Vogel. I'm a PhD researcher in the field of ecological economics and sustainability at the University of Leeds. And I'm doing my PhD on the Living Well Within Limits project that is led by Julia, who's here with us today. So, and investigating the grand challenge, I suppose, of, ensuring human well-being for everyone on the planet, while also remaining within planetary limits and averting sort of environmental catastrophe.
And I'm Julia Steinberger. So my main claim to fame at this point is being Jefim Vogel's PhD supervisor, and very happy to collaborate with him. And so indeed, I was lucky enough to get this project on Living Well Within Limits, where we try to study lots of different aspects of this interdisciplinary question of how can humans live well within planetary boundaries and using a lot less resources and studying inequality and all of that stuff. And I'm really excited to talk about this with Joey on this podcast.
Well, thanks. I was gonna hope that you say that like your claim to fame is being on this podcast a second time, but that's fine.
That's the main claim to fame in my whole life.
So we're going to primarily talk about a paper that you co-wrote, and there are others, please mention them as well, entitled Socioeconomic Conditions for Satisfying Human Needs at Low Energy Use, an International Analysis of Social Provisioning. So let's just start from the start. I have a bunch of questions. Some of them are coherent, some of them are semi-coherent. But let's just start with, if you can present the paper, like what is it about? What are some of its main arguments?
So I would say the paper investigates the interlinkage of the major environmental and social crises of our times. And we know that these environmental and social crises are interlinked, but we need to better understand how they're interlinked. And one of the main mechanisms that connect the environmental and the social crises is energy use, and that's sort of the baseline of the paper, because energy use is linked to climate breakdown via emissions of CO2 and other greenhouse gases that occur in the use of fossil fuels like oil and coal and gas. And of course, is also linked to a bunch of other environmental issues via extraction and pollution and so forth. But on the social side, energy use is also linked to social crises in the sense of material poverty and material deprivation, in particular through our lens, the insufficient satisfaction of basic human needs, because what defines the satisfaction of basic needs or the absence of poverty is that people are provided with the goods and services that meet their needs. So, for example, warm housing for the need for shelter, food and water for the need for nutrition, healthcare for, well, the need for health, safe sanitation for also health or hygiene, education for social participation, and so forth. And providing all of these goods and services requires energy. And basically the way that energy use links to both of these issues is through our economies, and economies not just as the system of money flows, but as sort of the systems of provision of all goods and services, those that meet our needs and those that are sort of beyond basic needs or indeed sort of irrelevant to basic needs, through all processes in the chain of provisioning, from the extraction of resources to production, transport, retail, and consumption. And that involves then physical systems and physical infrastructures like, factories and mines and whatnot, and social systems like markets and governments and laws and competition and what have you. If we look at these two dimensions that we're trying to reconcile, these two major issues that we're trying to reconcile, the issue of basic needs satisfaction, or very simply speaking, material poverty on the one hand, and the environmental issues on the other hand, the problem is that the one needs for tackling environmental crises, and in particular climate breakdown, we need to limit and indeed globally reduce energy use. So we can't use more than a given amount of energy use per person, let's say something on the order of 30 gigajoules per capita. But then on the side of meeting basic needs, we require a certain amount of energy use per person to provide the goods and services that meet those needs. And that's currently, say, something around 60 gigajoules per capita. So we, for human well-being, basically, we need something like at least 60 gigajoules per capita currently, while sort of to stay within planetary boundaries, we need to get below something like 30 gigajoules per capita or something like that. So that's a real dilemma, right? And on the environmental side, we can't do so much about that, because already this number, and that's sort of a rough estimate, around 30 gigajoules per capita, already assumes very deep and rapid transformations of the energy systems, rapid phase out of fossil fuels, and rapid rollout of renewable energy use. So that is already sort of a quite optimistic estimate in a sense. But what we can do something about, and that's very much the idea of this paper, is how much energy use is required per person to meet basic needs. And in particular, then how could we meet everyone's basic needs at low levels of energy use? And that varies with the characteristics of our economies or of our systems of provision that connect energy use on the sort of input side to the satisfaction of needs on the output side, or on the outcome side. So the idea is to understand what are the characteristics of these provisioning systems? So basically, our economy and the social systems that surround it. So basically, socioeconomic factors, or what we call provisioning factors, that influence at what levels of energy use different countries. We look at this at a country level, internationally across 106 countries. At what levels of energy use different countries achieve what levels of need satisfaction, and are there any countries that sufficiently meet all needs within low enough levels of energy use that they could be sustainable? And the answer to that is currently no, not at all. Far from that. And so what we try to assess quantitatively, statistically, is how the differences in the performance, in the relationship between need satisfaction as the outcome of provisioning and energy use as the input to provisioning are, so how different factors affect that, so how that varies with different characteristics. And so the idea is, are there some characteristics or some sort of like setups of the system that allows societies to get higher levels of need satisfaction at a given level of energy use, or the other way around. And that's sort of more directly relevant to the question, are there certain characteristics that would allow some countries to meet everyone's needs sufficiently at low levels of energy use? That's the basic idea. And what we find is that indeed there are a number of characteristics that are quite relevant, that have that show a large influence in this relationship. And they relate to things such as public service quality, income inequality, economic growth, extractivism, infrastructure, and so forth. But they don't all interact in the same way. There's sort of positive factors or beneficial factors, if you will, that make it more likely to reach need satisfaction at lower levels of energy use. And then there are negative factors, detrimental factors that make it less likely to reach high need satisfaction at low levels of energy use. So, and on the positive side, we find that higher levels of public service quality, higher levels of equality of income, or more equal income distributions, more fairer income distributions, if you will, and more stronger democracy, as well as universal access to electricity and to clean cooking fuels, are all beneficial to high need satisfactions at low levels of energy use. And on the negative side, in terms of detrimental factors, extractivism, so the prevalence of extractive industries, so coal, gas, for coal, gas, oil, minerals, and so forth. The more these are present in the economy, the less likely it is to achieve high well-being at low energy use. And also, levels of economic growth or economic growth rates are negatively associated at high levels of affluence, or moderate to high levels of affluence, negatively associated with human need satisfaction. So at higher levels of economic growth, need satisfaction outcomes are lower than average at a given level of energy use. And well, you asked about the background, but maybe that's where Julia could provide a better overview. So
yeah, thanks, Jefim. Julia, go ahead if you want.
Well, I think Jefim said quite a bit about, in terms of the background being these big challenges we face. I think that the thing that I was really excited about in this paper is that very often, when people think about how we connect, our consumption to well-being on the one side and unsustainability on the other, the thing that they put in the middle is human behavior and human preferences. And this study says, let's forget about that. That's not the way that interaction works. And it really puts what's in the middle at a social level. So it's at a level of the most important priorities of our societies, and how those priorities, how our societies prioritize different social goals, actually influences the overall sustainability potential of those societies of providing good things for their people at low energy levels. So that's one thing I really like about it, is because a lot of times people can't make that jump from it's about consumption, but it's not just an individual question. So I think that was one great thing about the study, that it really sort of broke that boundary. Some boundaries are good to break. And the other boundary, I think, and the other thing I thought that it was really, really good at doing is it does it empirically. I mean, we don't go into this with any like preconceptions or whatever. I hate to say this, Jefim is going to come through the screen and throttle me here, but it's when you throw a bunch of data into the hopper, right? Like you're just throwing data into this machine and you crank it. I mean, it's a beautiful machine. Jefim built it and it's like really cool. And he's doing all these cool stats and it's all very, very sophisticated. But you're just cranking, and out the other end come these really stunning results that say some things are going to help you, some things are going to hurt you. Here's the domain of validity of that. And I think that that's really, really impressive as well, that you can literally test for these things.
That's pretty cool. And so kind of general comments. So I guess on the one hand, it's also emphasizing that without necessarily negating individual changes, that this is not the most efficient way to get to this balance that we're seeking. And I guess balance is the word that comes to mind a lot, how to reach this equilibrium. I think you, like, the argument that you make, and please correct me at any point because this is the best of my understanding, is that like certain factors are associated with higher need satisfaction and actually require lower energy, they have a lower energy requirement, whereas certain other factors are the opposite. They have a lower need satisfaction and they actually have a greater energy requirement. So essentially, if like we were to extrapolate or kind of to get the ideal conclusion, is to how to meet those needs at the lowest required energy use, if that makes sense. If I'm trying to be coherent on this. So at the same time, the dilemma, like Jefim, you mentioned it, and Julia also, you hinted at this, there is a disparity between the energy consumption in most countries in the global north, and obviously in energy consumption in the global south. And here I'm kind of using those two terms, to simplify things a bit. How does one tackle the dilemma? How does the paper, what are certain arguments that what are certain conclusions that the paper makes that can help tackle this dilemma? And better yet, maybe this is a follow-up, depending how you want to answer. What do we usually misunderstand when we frame the problem like this, if that makes sense?
Yeah, so maybe just a quick clarification first, because you said like some factors have lower energy requirements and some factors have higher energy requirements. It's not so much the energy requirements of these socioeconomic factors as such, but rather that need satisfaction, certain levels of need satisfaction have energy requirements through what I explained, through the provisioning of goods and services. But but what changes is the level of energy requirement that is associated with a certain level of need satisfaction. And this changes with sort of with a condition, or with a kind of with a context, the socioeconomic context. And that's what these socioeconomic factors or provisioning factors that we assess are about. They sort of regulate or moderate the relationship between outcomes and inputs, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So they make it easier to achieve good outcomes with low inputs, or harder. That's if they're the detrimental ones. So yeah, to get to your question about development pathways and global north, global south. So yeah, that's exactly correct. That the dilemma really is that we have sort of two prominent clusters of countries. If we look at the international spectrum, there's the countries that sufficiently meet basic needs for most of the population, and all of these countries are highly unsustainable in terms of their level of energy use. So that's problematic in the environmental dimension. And then we have a group of countries that where the level of energy use per person is within the levels that could be globally sustainable, in the sense of compatible with limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees. But all of these countries see large parts of the populations heavily deprived of basic needs. So they're deficient on the social side, and deficient, of course, we should say, in light of large global injustices and stuff. Now, this is not just sort of underdevelopment. This is this is happening in the context of global appropriation and so forth. So that's maybe another topic that we could touch upon at some point. And of course, then there's other countries that are both unsustainable, ecologically speaking, so in terms of their levels of energy use, and deficient in their social outcomes and their need satisfaction. For example, because of extra high levels of extractivism or corruption. These are, for example, some of the OPEC countries. Okay, but anyway, like still with these two main clusters, of countries that are the types of countries that are environmentally unsustainable but socially meeting needs sufficiently, and on the other hand, the countries that are environmentally currently sustainable, but are heavily deprived of needs. They have sort of different. They sit on they face different challenges. If we are going to meet everyone's needs globally within planetary limits, and that's very much the normative or the aspiration that the paper tries to inform. Let's say. Then that means that countries where needs are currently met but at highly unsustainable levels of energy use, they would need to figure out ways to maintain roughly their levels of need satisfactions while dramatically reducing their energy use. In some countries by more than half, in some countries even by a factor of 4 or something like that, or even more, like with the very, very wasteful countries, so to speak. And for the countries, so this group of countries sort of roughly maps onto the global north, so to speak, yeah. And then the rough category of the global south, which is relatively low and hence relatively sustainable levels of energy use, but high levels of deprivation of basic needs, high levels of material poverty, so to speak. For them, the challenge would be to meet their basic needs for all of the population, and that's got to be a priority, I would argue, also in the context of climate change and climate justice. But in order for us to have a chance to stay within 1.5 degrees globally or anything close to that, they would, or the world as a whole, that probably could require financial or technological support from the global north, would have to find ways of doing that without following the same high energy development pathways that the global north has followed over the last century or so. So they would have to find ways of developing with high development outcomes on the social side, but with a very different development pathway than what the global north has sort of has done. And is still doing, of course. So another way to look at the kind of these socioeconomic factors is to identify factors that would allow for different development pathways, more sustainable, low energy development pathways.
I wanted to ask if that's okay if you can give us just some examples of which country, because I think you mentioned that only 29 countries meet the basics of what we can call need satisfaction, but do so very unsustainably, as you mentioned. And in total, you have 106 countries, which account for 90% of the world's population, 89% of global total final energy use, and 92% of global GDP. So pretty good representative sample. But what are these 29 countries? You said that there are, I think, all in the global north, or mostly in the global north. And then it's sort of, the reason why I'm asking is because as it happened, I just watched a very short doc by Vox talking about the end of oil. And one thing that they interview a bunch of activists in Nigeria who talk about the hypocrisy of this concept of leapfrogging, which if I understand correctly, is like developing but developing differently than how the global north did it. And the reason why they mention this hypocrisy is obviously that they would have to do so with using the same polluting mechanisms. And unfortunately, as we know, just based on empirical data, it's just not sustainable at a global scale. And so what they argue, the argument that's made by the activists, is a climate justice argument, environmental justice argument, that the global north needs to actually facilitate and help in that transition. So just to kind of have a more concrete picture for listeners who, like me, think very visually, like what are some of the countries what are these countries? What are the 29 countries?
The 29 countries where needs are currently met.
Mm-hmm.
Most of them are affluent countries, countries of the global north, of the OECD, let's say, which of course have very high levels of consumption. So it's not that high levels of consumption don't also meet basic needs. They tend to, but along with that comes a lot of other types of consumption that aren't maybe as necessary, that are often luxuries, or very wasteful types of consumption. Luxuries, of course, that's very heavily linked, and that's also something that we empirically find, or that our empirical findings support, is very much linked to inequalities, right? It's also within affluent countries, it's not that everyone uses crazy levels of energy, or like, everyone's consumption is associated with crazy levels of energy use. It's that also within countries there are sort of like rich segments of the population that have energy footprints and carbon footprints that are multiple times higher than that of the average population. But it's of course also, and this is kind of what the Living Well Within Limits project as a whole is digging into, but also what this paper digs into. It's very much related to the systems of provision or provisioning systems. If, for example, and this is something that's very typical in Europe and in North America, most transport revolves around private car use. And I know that you've previously interviewed Giulio and Julia about car dependency. Then needs or access to need satisfiers are highly dependent on a high energy use way of meeting those needs, right? Or if people live in large and, as in the UK, for example, very badly insulated houses, then just to have warm shelter, you need much more energy use than if you had smaller and better insulated houses, for example.
I think maybe to bring it back to more generalities, I think for me, one of the outcomes and one of the insights of this paper is that it really comes down to priorities, to what a society prioritizes. And the leapfrogging idea is that, to some extent, there's some validity to it, which is that in a country where you have not yet built a hard infrastructure that sort of condemns you to a very high energy intensive or very high carbon intensive way of running your activities, why would you not, if you have the choice, why would you not build out the necessary infrastructure in a way that does not commit you to high emissions or high resource intensity? So in that sense, there's sort of this idea of like, okay, if you have a choice, do it better, right? But at the same time, it's very disingenuous because developing the industrialized countries, the mature industrialized countries, are not they're not doing the leapfrog that they need to do, which is to transform their infrastructure, which is a challenge that everybody who has any infrastructure needs to do anyway. Now, I think that the work of Narasimha Rao of Yale here is very interesting because he actually does the calculations of like, what is the physical infrastructure necessary to provide decent living conditions to everybody? How much energy is it going to take? Like the build out of it, like the deployment of it. So he's really interested in modeling, like everybody needs a hard building. Like you've got all, millions of people living in shanty towns and with unsafe roads. If your road isn't safe, you do not have a safe way of getting to work. You do not have a safe way of getting to hospital, et cetera. So there are some things that everybody needs in order just to have a safe living environment as part of their decent living standards. And that requires a build out of infrastructure. So that infrastructure needs building. The question is, then what options do you have? So I like that perspective better. So building out decent living infrastructure, I think, is a better way than just saying, oh, just go leapfrog. It's like, so that's one thing. And I think the other way I would say it is that it's about priorities. It's about national priorities. And that's one of the things that we see in Jefim's paper is that if you have, for whatever resources you have, if you are prioritizing health, if you are prioritizing equity, if you are prioritizing the facilitating factors, that these enabling factors, if those are the things that your society is prioritizing, it will in fact also have an easier time providing decent living conditions at lower energy use. And so it's about having that coherence of what are we trying to protect here. We're trying to protect human lives. We're trying to make sure that there's no poverty, and we're trying to make sure that there's no overconsumption necessarily either. We're not trying to pursue economic growth for its own sake, because economic growth is actually detrimental, and most of it ends up in the pockets of the wealthiest, exacerbating inequality. So it's about the sort of ethos of a society, and if that ethos is turned towards these factors, in theory, at least according to what we can observe, they should be able to have a much better time of it.
You mentioned economic growth, and I guess this is a good transition to the next question I wanted to ask, is that you do mention stuff like the Sustainable Development Goals, the Green New Deals, the whole Build Back Better, which we're hearing now in the context of the states and stuff. What are if they were to, in ideal situations where the policymakers are reading this specific paper, what are certain things that they would be taking into account that they're not taking into account right now, if that makes sense? And if that's too broad, let me know.
Okay, I just want to maybe start on this issue because it's a very a debate that's often led very emotionally and very sort of like attached with a lot of attachment to the current sort of paradigm. So and then this debate often turns very toxic. So I want to just clarify to prevent these attacks that come again and again. What we are talking about when we are being critical of economic growth is two things. One is that we're talking primarily about economic growth in the global north, in countries that are already affluent and where most people's needs are already met, and also where economic growth has been shown not to benefit most of the population anymore, but is absolutely captured within the top 1% or the top one of the top 1%, whereas most of the population sees stagnating wages or even declining wages, declining living conditions. And in fact, through the same processes of growth, which is related to profits and to kind of privatization and so forth. But that picture looks a bit different in the global south, where it's absolutely important, and everyone in this field acknowledges that everyone, and particularly those that don't currently have their basic needs met, has a right basically to see those needs met. And in some countries where currently energy use is very low, resource use is very low, that means that levels of energy use and resource use need to increase somewhat. And also, so long as we live in an economy that is highly commodified, that is highly monetized, where everything revolves around money, and where people have to buy most of the things they need to meet their needs, that means also that most people need higher incomes, very much dependent on how the society is organized, very much dependent on, as Julia said, on like to what extent public service are free or not. So that that requires probably some level of income growth in countries of the global south, very simply speaking. But what hasn't necessarily what isn't necessarily like a development model that delivers good outcomes for these people is a model of sort of trickle down capitalist growth, where you just kind of pursue economic growth as a sort of as a supposed solution to all problems, where you just care about the economy growing and then assume or claim that would trickle down to everyone and will pull people out of poverty. It has pulled some people out of poverty, but most of it has landed in the pockets of the few, and also most of the growth in the south has landed again in the pockets of the few in the north, right? Has been appropriated by the global north. So I think we need to really distinguish, or we shouldn't. I mean, the term economic growth is already so so heavily charged with all sorts of ideologies that it's really, really hard to kind of have a meaningful discussion on the basis of this term. But what we really need to see is a prioritization of human well-being, of basic needs, and so forth. And then I think there are policies, and that gets me now to your question. There are policies, there are certain sort of ways of organizing the economy that is much more aligned with that. And economic growth, I would argue, is at best very inefficient at that, because most of it doesn't trickle down. And some of it, through some mechanisms, actually squeezes money out of the pockets of people and makes it harder for people to meet their needs. And and at worst, indeed, as in the global north, is associated with deteriorating livelihoods and deteriorating quality of life, and even deteriorating subjective life satisfaction. We've seen in lots of in most affluent countries, actually, while the economies have grown over the last decades, life satisfaction has gone down, and I think that tells us something very profound about also the social limits to growth. So to get to your question, I think how this can inform things like the Sustainable Development Goals and Green New Deals and Build Back Better, is on the one hand a different, or I would argue like the sort of the framing of the paper, the aspiration of the paper is very much aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals. Most of the dimensions of need satisfaction that we analyze are reflected in the Sustainable Development Goals, also in Kate Raworth's donut approach of the safe and just living space, and of course also the aspiration for environmental safety, or environmental protection is of course in the Sustainable Development Goals and central to the Green New Deals and Building Back Better and so forth. What this paper hopefully can inform is our ways of going about that. And our ways of going about that can't be to just pour sort of to just boost the economic growth engine and somehow hope. And that's I would argue that's really the main narrative, is that somehow secures jobs. If we're lucky, that somehow raises wages a little bit, and then somehow at the end of the day, people are a little bit better off or just as well off as now. And that's a very that's very little to do with how the system actually works. And that's sort of just a very narrow view on sort of maybe one out of 10 different places where we can intervene in the economy, and a very indirect one, and one that is also, as we know, associated with environmental destruction. And that's a real issue in the context of this paper, and why this paper sort of takes the approach of saying we need less energy use to start from, because it's been shown, and it's a very sort of, I would argue, solid finding in the empirical literature, that economic growth can only to a very limited extent be decoupled from environmental damage, from emissions and so forth. So that really what we need is a much more direct prioritization of social outcomes in a way that allows less resources energy use. And that's where the policies come in, that link onto our analysis. And there are, so one of the, I would argue, most promising findings that is really very tightly reflected by analysis is the idea of universal basic services, basically providing free, high quality public services to the entire population. I mean, it's that's not rocket science that's going to improve everyone's or secure everyone's basic needs. That's very obvious, reducing inequality through something like, on the one hand, minimum wages or minimum income levels, or something like a universal basic income potentially, with some conditions attached, and also limiting, higher taxes on high incomes and taxes on wealth and so forth. Again, that's not rocket science. That's going to mean that more of the consumption that happens in a country goes to the poorer half of the population, and not so much of that whole energy use and resource use and consumption goes into luxury consumption and the consumption of the top 10% and the top 1% and so forth. So I would argue it's some of those policies also around democracy, the idea of citizens' assemblies, which have gained a lot of traction in the UK, in France, in Germany, probably in lots of other countries, where anyway there is a sense, I think, that what is labeled democracy currently really isn't very democratic at all, and that one way that is much better at representing the views, but also the concerns and the daily life experiences of people of a very broad spectrum of the population, from reflective of different groups in the population, of in particular also marginalized communities and young people as well, that really brings these people together exposes them to sort of to scientific knowledge and other types of expertise, and then lets them get in dialogue to determine what kinds of policies or what kinds of approaches they would support, and what these trials or the process where these citizens' assemblies, for example, have been tested, find throughout the bench is that people support much more radical policies than what is reflected in sort of in the polls, or in obviously in elections, or in sort of in public discourse as it is reflected in the mainstream media. So that it also shows, I would argue, that there is much more support for different kinds of policies and different ways of organizing the economy and different priorities to begin with.
I wanted to I had mentioned I mentioned this in a previous episode as well. Like I had read the briefing by the the European Environment Agency, because I had published this briefing in beginning of this year, I think, it's called Growth Without Economic Growth. Now, I don't know, this might be a kind of a reflection or a repetition, I'm not sure, but of the question of what I think you already answered it basically. They're like, because the title is one thing, and then the conclusions are essentially, well, we need degrowth and post-growth essentially, but it's just the title has to still include growth in its title. And I was wondering, how would one go about, and this is just, personal opinions, feel free to answer however you want, to tackle this belief that growth equals good, that growth just has, because just on an emotional level, it's a term that we use for everything, like, emotional growth and personal growth and whatnot. And it's obviously used in the discourse by politicians within electoral campaigns. I mean, you mentioned Julie before. I've seen that he's been ranting a lot on Twitter, for example, on how the car related debates in Germany have been going, for example. And there's a certain way in which these things are framed that then takes us very far away from what we need to be talking about. And so my next question was actually going to be on like the importance of like citizen assemblies and stuff like that. So yeah, I wanted to ask if you can talk more about that.
Well, I think you're raising all kinds of really important points around that basically the notion of growth, and which is really about development, which is really about growth in qualitative things, not quantitative things. When you grow emotionally, it doesn't mean that you have a new organ that sticks out from behind your head that is your emotion bubble or whatever, So it's really weaponizing a very sort of vague term, and saying that, and really channeling all human aspiration through this very narrow metric and very narrow way of doing things, which in fact benefits the most powerful at the expense of everybody else, and is also destroying the planet, which is a very bad thing. And so I think that that's something that really needs to be sort of debated and discussed and understood. And in that process, I think one of the things that's really a positive development is this idea of citizens' assemblies, as they were pioneered sort of in Ireland, probably most prominently, but in other places as well. And I guess one of the things to say is citizen assemblies are just one example of a whole array of fantastic, participatory, immersive, engaged citizens coming together and discussing how to do things differently and how to understand things differently. But each of them could, I think that's one of the things that's really exciting about the time we live in, is that, we get to try these different things out and see what we can get from them. And see how we can really use them to move our moment forward. I think one of the things that's really great about citizen assemblies is if and when they are broadcast, because I have been in some of the rooms where these assemblies were happening. I've been part of some of the processes, and I could see transformation happening right then and there. I could see not just like learning, but engagement, but people changing their minds, people transforming how they understood the world. Like it's just a magic place to be. And it's a magic moment to be in and to be part of it. And I was there as an expert, but my understanding was changing too, right? Because you're talking to real people, and it's so important. And we forget that. And the thing is that not everybody gets to be part of that room. If everybody in the world, if we had a way of making everybody in the world be in a citizens' assembly on climate, we could do it today and we'd be done tomorrow, right? But we need to bring people into that room somehow. We need to bring people into that process, which has to be done with a small group of people. Otherwise, you don't get the kind of communication and debate you need. And so I think that media is really important. So one of the things that really made the Irish Citizens Assembly on Abortion a success was that it was transmitted live on Facebook, I think. And people just tuned in and rebroadcast stuff, and like people cared about it. And it was really sort of its own broadcast mechanism. Now for other topics, we need other ways. But I think so media engagement and rebroadcasting of these things is essential. So that basically people get to be part of the journey of understanding that this microcosm of society is going through. And that's really, really important, because that changes everything. That changes absolutely everything. So I think that those kinds of processes are a fantastic way of moving us all forwards by leaps and bounds, much faster than you can just by seeing one thing written here, one thing written there, one newspaper article there, one opinion column there.
I mean, indeed, this title, "Growth Without Economic Growth," it's ridiculous, isn't it? It's like it really shows an attachment as well as it's almost an oxymoron, isn't it? But it relates, of course, to the idea that or to an idea that people maybe in the establishment and political and economic elites, but maybe also people more in the broader population aren't ready to give up on, because as Julia was touching upon, because they've been, because these narratives around growth as progress, as the savior, as the sort of like the silver bullet solution to all problems, have been promoted so broadly and have been, have pushed out like propaganda for decades and decades. And I think that has been established that way. And that's something that I'm looking at in my current research, because growth is, of course, the way out for profit, right? Growth is, of course, what underpins profit and what enables profit to happen without negotiating with people's livelihoods, in the sense. So like growth is, of course, a way out of distributional conflict, right? If you don't have growth, then of course there's much harder competition about the existing pie, so to speak. And so growth has been sort of promoted and pursued as the way out of negotiating between profits of the rich and the livelihoods of the many. But not only for the reasons that we've touched upon, the environmental reasons, but also for a number of other reasons, growth anyway is coming to an end, or the reliance on growth is coming to an end, because we're also faced with secular stagnation. We're also faced with an increasing amount of crises, environmental crises, of course, increasingly, but also public health crises, right? We're currently in a pandemic, of course, where that derail the economy, that bring the economy to a certain standstill, and in the current economy where everything relies on the economy, to continue and to grow, and as soon as it doesn't, things collapse basically, and we're in crisis and we're facing hardship. That's a very, very vulnerable economy. And in the 21st century, where we're faced with multiple crises, as well as hard or very, very unnegotiable environmental limits and resource limits as well. I think we really have to learn to design our economies without relying on growth.
It just makes me think of like one of the sentences that I like from the degrowth movement is, change by design instead of by disaster. So that kind of comes to mind pretty obviously, I think. One thing that before kind of getting into the book section, if that's okay, kind of a couple of questions that may be interlinked, I'm not sure. The first one is like, what do you see as the kind of the next step for this paper or this research, or the conclusions that you've reached in this research? What are certain things that can follow from it? Like
where should the research go, or where should societies go?
Both.
Should the research?
You can start with the research, yeah.
Well, in terms of the research, quite a few things, of course. One is that we would need to look at this over time. is one dimension, and we would need to be able to look at a lot of things that we currently can't look at because they're not being measured. And they're not being measured because they're not prioritized, because our model links back to the model of development that cares about certain things, right? That cares about GDP, that cares about maybe some aspects of material poverty, but not others, right? So it relates to societal priorities, but a lot of the things that we would be really interested in assessing here and measuring, or in being able to analyze in this kind of analysis, we can't, because there is no data on that. So that relates, for example, to international interrelations between countries in terms of what I touched upon in terms of appropriation of resources and of value, and in sort of more political economic aspects of vested interests, transnational corporations, these sort of things, as well as looking at how things have changed over time. But of course, this is also this is a very high level analysis what we've done here. So of course, this would need to be broken down into more specific context. You would need to look at this at the national level and indeed at subnational level, which fortunately other people in this research project are doing in sort of in very, I would say, complementary ways. Looking at income inequalities within countries, looking at household level differences, and looking indeed at specific systems of provision around, for example, transport, around electricity and energy systems, and so forth, and also at processes that we just touched upon of democratic deliberation and so forth. But I think, and this is also something that we touched upon, but that also in this project, but that requires a broader effort, is what at some point in a draft that I think that what didn't quite make the cut, but is sort of what I call the ultimate provisioning factor, which is the political economic system, which constrains all of this, right? So all the reason why provisioning systems are currently designed in a particular way links to the grand political economic system that is dominant in the world. And because we've recently had this paper published, some colleagues of ours in Leeds had this paper published that said, permission to say capitalism, I'm now allowed to call it capitalism, paper by Stephen Hall and Mark Davis, that very much shapes how things are happening currently and what's possible currently. And that reinforces itself through the power structures that are entailed in it, right? Where vested interests have a huge influence on politics, on public opinion, on the media, and so forth, and so make it very, very difficult for change to happen. So I would say the broader thing that needs to happen, academic or in terms of research, is to better understand the fundamental, I think that actually the fundamental issues with that system are very well understood. They haven't, they're not yet established in broader public discourse, although they are definitely getting there. And indeed, you mentioned degrowth, which has really gained traction over the last few years. And I don't think it's a coincidence that this is happening in a context where the world as we know it is crumbling to pieces. That's when people are looking for alternatives, and there are alternatives out there now, different from in the 2008 and 2009 crisis, where that kind of hasn't translated into transformative change, and whether the COVID crisis does so is yet to be seen, I would say. But what was definitely changing, I would argue, is the discourse and the awareness that there's something much deeper going on, and that needs addressing. And indeed, people on this, on the streets and the environmental and social movements, they realize that, including the youth strikers, the school strikers, and Fridays for Future and so forth, that talk about things like planet over profit, which really drills, which really hits the nail on the head, because that's exactly what it is about. So I think we need more research along those lines, of what could a different political economic system look like? What could a system look like that, as I said, that secures livelihoods, that provides welfare without economic growth, and indeed in a selectively shrinking economy, probably. But then this is the what, if you will, or like I think of it as the what. What kinds of systems would enable living well within limits, would enable human well-being for everyone within planetary limits. But then the part that I think it receives even much less attention, but that is probably as crucial, is how do we get there, right? And that's about how change happens, and how it is being resisted, right? You pointed to that, and we touched a little bit upon that in terms of vested interest, in terms of propaganda, in terms of discourse, in terms of very, these are not passive mechanisms, right? We know of the story of the merchants of doubt and how the fossil fuel industries has for decades and continues to disinform, deflect, delay, another project that another paper that Julia was involved, and maybe she can tell a bit more about it in a second, is this paper on the discourses of climate delay, led by Will Lamb, also a co-supervisor on my PhD, and so basically the kind of emancipatory changes towards human well-being and environmental protection are being very actively opposed by those that benefit from the status quo financially or in terms of power. And so one of the things that's really important to better understand is, of course, the role, ways things can change, in particular the role of social movements, in particular, ways of rapid social change and the different roles that different actors in society can play in that. But then, of course, that's only the side of knowledge, and then really what we need is action. What we need much more of. So that's a whole different story. But but the main thing, of course, we need is, because I would argue, by and large, we know enough to go very well in the right direction. Right? We know very much what we can't have. We know very well what we need to stop with immediately. We know very well a few things that would immediately get us on the right track, right? In terms of so if we curtail, for example, luxury consumption, that could almost overnight, as Kevin Anderson keeps arguing, very rightly so, could almost overnight cut emissions globally by a third. That's the kind of emergency intervention that would really make a difference. And then we could sort of start sailing in the right direction. And we know, a lot of the types of policies that could secure people's lives in the transition, while sort of gaining some time to figure out some of the questions that aren't yet known. Maybe I'll leave it there.
Did you want to add anything, Julia?
Yeah, so in terms of next research, Jefim outlined a lot of things. I think one of the things I'd like to do is have some more specifics. I'm really excited about specifics of provisioning systems. I think this provisioning system thing, this idea that we and maybe this ties in with some of your podcast interests around solar punks and so on, which is that everybody likes to discuss economic organization in generalities, but I think specifics matter a lot to people's daily life. And so I think we need to study hey, what would be good ideas for organizing provision of food differently, provisioning healthcare differently, housing, transport. So all of these things could have different combinations of things, because everybody's oh, you always need a worker cooperative or this. Well, for some cases, you need a consumer cooperative or user cooperative, or a community cooperative, different forms of things we need probably benefit from different forms of more or less localized, more or less democratically managed provision. And so I think that's actually super interesting to study. And there's some people doing it around food and farming and stuff like that, but I think we need to do it for all of these different things and sort of have so you could almost choose off the menu, what do you want to do for your provisioning systems? Well, I'd quite like this kind of community energy thing. It's we can be creative about this and study a lot more, and also understand the pros and cons and risks of these different ways of governing the things that matter to make our lives possible. So I think that's one of the things that's really, really interesting. The other thing that I'd like to try to study, and also study it in terms of the physical underpinning of a decent functioning healthcare system, we've done in very broad brush strokes, in the past, but we can do it with a lot more specifics. So that's one thing. The other thing I think is to try to understand some of how we can connect degrowth and modern monetary theory a bit more. Because I think that there's this idea of what a sovereign economy means. And when I hear Stephanie Kelton speak about it, I'm trying to sort of follow what she's doing. She talks about the real economy, which is the economy that we have the capacity to make, the thing that we have, where we have the capacity, the work capacity, the know-how, the resources to make things happen. And she basically says you can't have the kinds of crises and inflation and so on if you're using the real economy. And so one of the things I would like to understand is how we can connect these ideas of universal basic services and sufficient provisioning for all with what is our real economy? What do we have the productive real capacity to do? And then think about the economic system that would be the, if we need a monetary terms of exchange to do that, what that looks like. But I think that that's what's really important, is that right now we have productive capacity that's either underused or misused, and it's about reorienting that. But how do we think about that? Those are sort of two directions.
All right. Well, I mean, before getting into the book section, if that's okay, is there any topic you wanted me to get into? Any questions you wish I would have asked, or did I do a decent-ish job as a host?
You're a fantastic host, as you know. But I think, yeah, I was hoping, it's kind of, I guess you got it right, that this, I think this paper is like fantastic that you asked us to talk about. I think it really brings the debate a whole bunch of steps forward. But I was also afraid that it would sort of die a death because there's too much maths and too much analysis, and that people would be like, just not be able to deal. And so I think it's really great if we're able to just sort of discuss it at the level that people can sort of grapple with what it means. We're really talking about what parameters, socioeconomic parameters, allow us to move our societies into a more sustainable direction, both environmentally and socially. And there's that we have some sort of big steering wheels where if we steer those in certain directions, they can really help us get there. I think that's the main idea.
I definitely think this paper would be really good as like video infographics and video essays and stuff like that. Because I think very visually, so I can really picture like a Vox explainer type or a series of them actually exploring different contexts. They do it well when they do it well, and sometimes they do it not as well, but that's a critique for another time. Jefim, anything else on your side?
I think I would agree with Julia. You've been a great host, and I think we've covered a lot. One thing I forgot to mention, maybe around the citizens' assembly thing, is that there are initiatives actually in the UK, and I was lucky enough to be involved in one that tried to explicitly link this. The thing I'm talking about is the CEE bill, the Climate and Ecological Emergency Bill, and Julia was also one of the expert contributors that have been asked to, that have informed the formulation of the bill. And what this bill would do is to tie some principles, some sort of targets on both the climate emergency and the ecological emergency in terms of biodiversity loss and ecosystems, which is as important and maybe talked about a bit less, to a democratic body at the heart of it, a citizens' assembly, that would decide the strategies, or that would sort of inform the strategies of how this is being met. So there are campaigns out there that already connect some of the dots. And I think this one is a really, really promising one that could be a blueprint that could be followed by other countries as well, and that in particular in the run-up to COP26 would really be a way for the UK that hosts COP26, of course, to show real leadership and a type of leadership that could, spark a different kind of international climate regime that is much more based on climate justice, that links with the kind of, I suppose, analysis and worldview that also underpins the paper that we've been talking about today, that recognizes different responsibilities, but also different capacities of different countries and different levels of emissions and so forth, and grounds the response of countries in an equitable approach, and one that protects marginalized communities and workers in affected sectors domestically. So there as well, I think we are starting to see ways of integrating these things, and some of the Green New Deal packages do that as well. That they really tie in this idea of social justice and climate justice, and tie them together, of protecting people's livelihoods, of protecting people's well-being, and through things such as green jobs, but also through things such as universal basic services, universal basic income, and tying that to really radical, well, some more than others, but to radical, environmental protections. And for example, there's been proposals for a Green New Deal without growth that would incorporate a lot of the ideas and policies that we've been talking about today, and that also are very much in line with the analysis in our paper.
Thanks a lot for that. All right, well, I always end the episodes by asking the guests if they can recommend 3 books. So what are 3 books that you would recommend, and if you can say why as well?
So I haven't quite made my mind. I will do that in this very second. It's always hard. But one book I definitely want to recommend is, I'll just hold it in the camera, although no one can see the camera, is Less is More by Jason Hickel, with the subtitle, How Degrowth Will Save the World. And so it is, I would argue it is, to me, one of the most holistic overviews over the environmental and social problems of our times, in a really sort of deep critical analysis of the systems that causes of capitalism, of its history of capitalism as well, and its colonial roots, linking it to neo-colonial practices that sort of still continue to this day, and that are still very much part and parcel of the issue, and of what's holding us back from tackling it on either side. So both on the environmental and on the social justice side. And I think it's kind of a combination of a really brilliant analysis of where we're at, and a really sort of hopeful but realistic picture. I would argue realistic in the sense of, like, if we manage to mobilize around these ideas, and maybe I haven't stressed this enough, but like, I think really these ideas around degrowth, even though they're often misportrayed, there really are a chance to reconcile environmental and social issues, also in a way that speaks to, that addresses the concerns of people across the population, including very much workers. So it's something that should very much speak to workers, to trade unions, and so forth. So that I see these kind of ideas that are being put forward there as a way to also unite, or to kind of as a point of convergence for environmental movements, social movements, and labor movements. And I think that's the kind of as well as, and this is really, really, really important in degrowth discourse today, to link that to decolonial struggles, to feminist struggles, to struggles of environmental injustice in terms of environmental conflict around the world, but in particular in the global south, that are of course linked to our consumption and to our profit making in the global north. So these kind of ideas that are being pushed forward there, I think, are really a chance to kind of to see common causes across these struggles, and a kind of analysis that pulls these things together, I think. And that's also why I see degrowth as a sort of umbrella analysis in particular, that really shows these connections, and that shows, I would argue, not a perfect, but a sort of quite holistic approach for how to address this, and quite a hopeful one, I think. That's also why degrowth is, why sort of this idea of utopian thinking as a positive, not an impossible, but also a positive thing, is sort of quite prominently put forward in degrowth discourse. And the second book I want to recommend is sort of maybe a bit less positive in that sense, but it's really important because it really, I think, speaks to or touches upon many of the issues that really get in the way big time. It's a book by Noam Chomsky called The 10 Principles of Concentration of Wealth and Power. I mean, of course, there's, Noam Chomsky has more books than, than anyone could ever read. And I'm sure there's lots of good ones. This is one that I find is a sort of a short and accessible summary of really key issues that that are central to all of these things in a very, good and critical understanding of power, of vested interests, of propaganda, of the workings of the media, of the false notions of democracy, like in the sense of of the illusion of democracy that is being created, and of the lack of real democracy. So I think in public debate and also academic debate of the issues, but also of solutions or ways forward, we really, really need to, look the devil deep down the throat and really understand kind of the maybe that's not the right saying, but really need to understand the mechanisms that resist emancipatory changes and that sort of are very highly vested into the status quo and that will fight it, whatever they have, to prevent some of these changes that we're talking about. So to me, that's kind of the two of the main sort of ideas that are critical for social change at a political level, and it has to be like at a collective level. But the third book I want to recommend is much more on the personal level, but that I think is also something that is kind of very relevant to our time. So this is a book by Brené Brown, who's a social researcher. It's called Daring Greatly, and it's very much about notions of vulnerability and shame and sort of like a more wholehearted living that I found sort of like personally really valuable in different ways of relating to each other. And I think, in the sort of bigger picture, the kinds of changes that we need are so all encompassing. But like one thing that absolutely has to change in the long run is a change in our culture, and that transcends, of course, all areas, including personal interaction. I think, I found her approaches really powerful for a way of interacting and communicating that is that gets to the bottom of what connects us rather than what keeps us apart, I suppose. So I'll leave it there.
So I get 3 books. So the ones of Jefim sound great, and hopefully there's no doubles. So I want to recommend The Future Earth by Eric Holthaus, because I've been reading that and enjoying it. And it has a lot in it, lots of different ideas, lots of different testimonies of different people. So it's a radical vision of what's possible in the age of warming. And I think it's pretty great. Another one is, it's older. So The Future Earth came out quite recently, but this one is a couple of years older. It's from 2014, is We Make Our Own History by Cox and Nielsen. And they're sort of Marxist historians of social movements. And they have this idea of, I think they have ideas that can really help the sort of contestation movements that we see today, because that we're sort of stuck in this liberal paradigm of demanding things from power. And they have a very different idea of what power looks like and what social movements look like and how they can create disruption and change. And also they have this idea of social movements from above, because I think a lot of us are sort of, from a social science perspective, we're stuck in this idea that structures of power, we have these structures that are sort of imposing bad things on us, including growth. And they're like, listen, it's gangs, and the gangs are associated together, and there are people in them, and you can understand that. And they, they like us, like we can understand them, like we can understand our own work. They have campaigns too. They have things they're trying to get done too. They have weaknesses and disagreements too. And the more you understand them as sort of a bit more of a messy conglomerate of groups and individuals with very varying agendas, the more you're going to be effective in actually trying to disrupt that structure. So I think that's quite a helpful book. And the third one has just come out, and I haven't read it, but I'm assuming it's going to be absolutely great. I can't wait. And it's called Overheated by Kate Aronoff: How Capitalism Broke the Planet and How We Fight Back. And since Kate Aronoff is one of the smartest people out here and one of the best writers, and this exactly on these topics, I think that is going to be a heck of a book. And so I really am looking forward to reading that one. So go get it, everybody.
Amazing. Well, Jefim and Julia, thanks a lot for your time. I really enjoyed it, and I'm pretty sure listeners would agree.
Thanks so much, Joey. Yeah, it's been a pleasure. Thanks for having us.
My pleasure.
Thanks, Joey.
Disparities Times is made possible by supporters on Patreon. If you'd like to support through a monthly donation, you can head out to patreon.com/FireThesTimes. And if you want to explore other options, you can do so by checking out the website.